It's been 2 months since a ceasefire was announced in Gaza. Many would argue it hasn't really taken place, as Israel has killed nearly 400 people. And while the bombardment has largely stopped, so much uncertainty remains for those who are still alive. They've been waiting for the second phase of President Donald Trump's so-called peace plan so they can start to look ahead for a brighter future, or at least start to rebuild their lives and their homes. Trump's 20-point plan seemed comprehensive, but in reality left much to the imagination, and now Israel, Hamas, and mediators are struggling to agree on what happens next. Phase 2 is supposed to outline the details of Israel's withdrawal, the installation of a stabilization force, and the formation of a governance committee. But Hamas's disarmament and Israel's withdrawal seem linked to one another. All the while, Gazans are stuck in tents under the rain. Deaths are announced every single day. Drones still hover overhead, and aid continues to be blocked from entering at the scale mandated by the ceasefire. People have little trust for what's to come. They've been let down before when Israel unilaterally broke the last ceasefire in March. Now, as momentum builds towards the next phase of the ceasefire, will it all materialize into anything tangible, or will it collapse altogether? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we look at the challenges standing in the way of Phase 2, and we ask what's stopping it all from going ahead. Israel has violated the ceasefire agreement hundreds of times since it first came into effect on October 10th. To understand what comes next, it's worth examining why the first phase has been so unstable and how a peace plan can even be built on such a shaky foundation. To discuss all of this, I'm joined by Max Rodenbeck, Israel-Palestine Director at the International Crisis Group. Max, it's been a ceasefire, but with a lot of fire, right? Israel's almost daily attacks have pretty much gone unchecked, haven't they? With now more than 380 Palestinians killed in 2 months and counting. Hamas, in the meantime, has been clashing with militias. So, in short, a lot of chaos, not much peace, or at least not the peace that we've anticipated. Why haven't we seen any tighter measures, control by the mediators, the people overseeing all of this?
It's not just that Israel has broken it with a lot of violence, but also some important parts of the Trump plan haven't been carried through, like the opening of the Rafah crossing to Egypt in both directions. And also the movement of much higher volumes of aid into Gaza has not been reached yet, although it has been slowly improving. But the particular kind of aid also is supposed to be the beginnings of reconstruction in phase 1 of the sewage system, the water system, electricity system, and clearing of roads and stuff like that. We haven't seen much of that because the equipment isn't being allowed in. So that's phase 1. Phase 2, that was the worry all along, that there'd be a long, big pause before we got to phase 2. And the fact is that this is a very awkward peace plan put together in a rather haphazard manner. Unfortunately, it's the only plan we have. There isn't an alternative. But one of the things that it doesn't have is a monitoring mechanism. There's no body there to call out violations of the ceasefire. The Americans have set up this civil military coordination unit in Israel, which is manned by American and sort of international officers. But they don't really have a monitoring role. And when you talk to people there, they say, we're not allowed to call out violations. That's not what we're here for. What they say is that if there's something like that, and we think, say, the Israelis have violated the ceasefire, we're not allowed to point the finger at them. That has to go to what they call the political level. And the political level is different people. It's a completely different office that seems to be under the supervision of the American envoys of Witkoff and Jared Kushner.
And you mentioned Rafah border crossing being opened only in one direction rather than in both. This was jointly condemned, obviously, by at least 8 countries, including Egypt, Jordan, and even Qatar, one of the very mediators of the ceasefire. How do you read this move by Israel to open the border in one direction while it's still preventing sufficient aid from entering, as required by the peace plan, and, as documented widely, even by us, some doctors are being prevented from entering?
From the Israeli perspective, what they're saying is that the first phase isn't over yet because although Hamas has returned all the living hostages and all of the dead bodies that it had in its possession, except for one, there's one left, one body, which is very difficult to find. So the Israelis are saying Hamas has not yet fulfilled part 1 of the ceasefire. But I think they're the other parties to this are all kind of beginning to lose patience with this argument. But I mean, the reason why the Israelis were speaking of opening Rafah in only one direction is quite obvious. I mean, one of their plans, and from the very beginning, has been to persuade, convince, force Gazans to leave Gaza, and preferably, from the Israeli perspective, not come back. The other thing is that, as it is now, Israel controls everything that goes in and everything that goes out of Gaza. And the only crossing that Gaza has into international space is through Rafah. So the Israelis don't want to give up their control of all the goods going into Gaza, all the people going into Gaza, or even dilute that control. According to the treaty, Rafah should have been opened in both directions some time ago.
And you mentioned this briefly, the stabilization force that is supposed to be made up of Arab and Muslim majority countries, advocated for by Washington, but they've failed basically to get proper consensus by these states to get completely 100% on board. Some of the arguments are that these states might find themselves as a de facto occupier, also risking their own troops, finding themselves clashing with armed groups inside of Gaza, while Israel basically stands along the border pointing guns and ready to fire at any given moment. Do you think, first of all, that this idea is even practical? And what do you think it would take to get everybody on board?
Part of the problem since the ceasefire has been putting together what exact framework is, because there were very different interpretations of what that force should do. From the Israelis, who claim to believe that that force would do what the IDF hasn't done, which is to go into Gaza and get Hamas's guns. On the other hand, the interpretation of almost everyone else, certainly the other mediators, Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, has been that the international stabilization force would be something of a buffer between Israel and the rest of Gaza. The Americans didn't seem to have a very clear idea of what this force would do. And they appear to be slightly coming around to the opinion of the rest of the world, basically, which is that this force cannot be a force that goes in and disarms. It's not practical. No country will lend soldiers to a mission like that, which could be open-ended, could be extremely messy, against the will of Hamas, against the will of the people of Gaza, perhaps. And they would be trying to do something which the Israeli army in 2 years was unable to do. But what they're talking about now is that the Americans have divided Gaza in their minds, they're planning into a red zone and a green zone. The red zone is where Hamas is still in governance. The red zone is also where 2 million people live. The green zone is the part which Israel controls, which is 53% of Gaza. It's virtually empty of people and virtually empty of buildings, which have all been destroyed. So the idea is that the international stabilization force would be deployed in the green zone. And there would be no engagement between those forces, international forces, and Hamas and other Palestinian forces. And the ISF might play a role in the eventual decommissioning of weapons by Hamas, but not a role of taking away the weapons, just a role of being there to observe the handover of weapons, if this happens, right? That's the new understanding, which I gather that the Americans are having. But part of the trouble is that the Israelis have not yet quite come around to that. And something that's very basic for the Israelis is they want to have the freedom to keep attacking. And the Israelis have never historically liked having an international force on their borders, which kind of locks them in. So this is still a delicate matter, but it's not surprising that no one has wanted to offer troops to an organization that doesn't have a mission.
The UN Security Council's resolution to endorse Donald Trump's peace plan was met with mixed reactions. Some have criticized it for legitimizing colonialism under the US and Israel control of Gaza. Others have welcomed it as a positive step towards facilitating peacekeeping efforts for the long run. Where do you stand in all of this, and what do you make of it? But also, what form do you think this resolution is going to take place in Gaza?
I think there are very legitimate concerns about the UN Security Council resolution, not only its content, but the way it came about and so on.
What are these concerns?
Well, I mean, there are concerns about, basically this was an American project. It's an endorsement of an American project. It's not an endorsement of the typical kind of peacekeeping operation that the UN, for example, has sponsored in the past. It's a very unusual shape where there's never been anything like a board of peace that is run by the president of some country that is endorsed by the Security Council. It's just unusual, that Donald Trump himself is going to be the king of Gaza. Unfortunately, this is the world we live in, and that's the resolution that we have. And it does empower and put the world behind this 20-point plan, which is It's an awkward plan. It's ambiguous in many places, but this sets a framework within which we're kind of obliged to operate right now. And it's very easy to point fingers and say, well, people should have objected to this Security Council resolution. They should have changed it. They should have pushed harder. It did get modified slightly before it came through. But I think most governments involved, including governments that are very, supportive of the Palestinians, they felt that it was just important to keep America on board because it's the only country that can actually has any leverage over Israel. So it's crucial to have the US on board. And it's crucial to keep this thing moving, keep the ceasefire going and stop getting people killed.
I do want to talk about disarmament, and it seems to be very akin to the Lebanon situation where Hezbollah is asking Israel to withdraw first before it disarms, and Israel is asking Hezbollah to disarm first before it withdraws. It seems that this is basically the same situation that's happening in Gaza, with Hamas saying that it's ready to lay down heavy arms under the supervision of Egypt and the authorities in the West Bank on the condition that Israel withdraws. Israel itself is saying, no, you withdraw first as a prerequisite for anything else. Are we going to be at a standstill, do you think, for long?
There are strong similarities between these two situations. The situation with Hezbollah between Lebanon and Israel has been going on for years and hasn't been resolved. And that's obviously makes one worried about Gaza. Are we falling into the same situation where the Israelis claim that to defend themselves, they have to keep bombing their neighbors? The sequencing is difficult. I think Hamas and Gaza, it's a much smaller space than southern Lebanon. In a way, it's under complete Israeli siege already right now. And also Hamas has basically, there's very little offensive capacity that Hamas has left, unlike Hezbollah, which still has some offensive capacity to actually strike at Israel. Also, there's diplomatic focus on Gaza, and there's a will to make this happen. And there's a Security Council resolution that actually literally calls for the disarmament of Hamas. Again, there's a problem of different interpretations because the original 20-point plan is so ambiguous. So it allowed different people to interpret it in different ways, which is one of the reasons why it worked, because it was ambiguous. The Israelis still seem to cling to the idea that Hamas is going to give up all its weapons. And Hamas argues that it argues that our weapons are right. We have a right to have weapons to fight the occupation. But aside from that, Hamas has shown some flexibility, doesn't want to go into detail. But the other mediators have kind of hinted and let it be known that Hamas may be prepared to give up perhaps its heavy weapons or find some way to decommission, to hand over the weapons to a neutral party. And Hamas's main condition for giving up its weapons is that it says they will give up their weapons only to a Palestinian government. There are ways where that sort of conditionality can be met halfway, because Hamas seems willing to go that way, actually. And Hamas is in a very difficult situation in Gaza. They've already said they don't want to be in government, and they've already lost a lot of people. They paid a very high price. So I think disarmament of Hamas is perhaps less of a complex situation than the Lebanese one with Hezbollah. The Americans are the obvious people that could make this all happen, both in Gaza and in Lebanon. And there's a problem with sort of keeping the administration's attention span. They don't have big teams. They seem to do this all under the Trump administration in a very ad hoc manner. But with more focus and some sort of more flexibility, I think both the Hezbollah and Hamas situations are resolvable. But I think actually the Hamas one is maybe easier.
This comes 9 months after we first discussed it on this podcast. And that's the issue of reconstruction. There's not only the issue of the fact that there's no construction material coming in, no shelter coming